promoting environmental literacy. I just want to have to say, because when you're looking at the events of the region these days, it's very hard to think about what's going on when you also sort of acknowledge that there's been a huge brain drain in the region. A statistic that floats around oftentimes is that 70% of all Arab PhD holders now live in the diaspora. So when I see that all of you did most of your sort of early graduate work at AUB, went on to get your PhDs and came back to the AUB to teach, it is just so heartwarming and so admirable and commendable. We admire you for all your great work and efforts. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Nadine in terms of the order of the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, you can see my screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Amani, for the introduction, and thank you, Lara and Christy, for the organization. So the project I'm going to talk about is on public debt sustainability and fiscal space in the MENA region. And this project was funded by the Bobst-AUB Research Grant Award number 103586. So to give you a brief idea of what the project is about or what the motivation is, it's the fact that government gross debt as a share of GDP in the MENA region has been rising or has been on an upward trend since the past decade. And this is due to multiple reasons, including all the socioeconomic and political shocks that this region has been facing, especially in terms of middle-income MENA countries. But high-income MENA countries like oil exporters have also faced shocks specifically to oil prices starting 2014, where when these oil prices fell, their fiscal balances has worsened, and this has revealed that they have been struggling with issues of debt due to the fall in oil revenues. So the purpose of this paper is to develop a stochastic general equilibrium model, which incorporates a nonlinear state-dependent fiscal limit and to provide estimates on fiscal limits for these countries. And within this framework, the fiscal limit will be defined as the maximum level of government debt that an economy could sustain. And these fiscal limits are country-specific. So I'll go country by country into studying their government policy, economic growth, investors' preferences, and calibrating the model to the countries individually to arrive at their fiscal limit. And the main contribution to the literature is that none of the previous studies on fiscal sustainability in the MENA region has considered such a framework. And most of the papers usually consider what we call an empirical fiscal reaction function to hint at sustainability. So in that sense, this paper is the first in the literature to employ a DSGE framework that is suitable for analysis of debt sustainability. Now, in terms of what I have done before, I'm not going to burden you with all the details of the modeling. So I've developed the main framework for the model, and I've made it like country specific because of the differences in how fiscal policy is carried out in oil countries versus non-oil exporting countries. So you would see here, for example, that governments of non-oil exporting countries would finance their spending and their transfers only through debt and through taxation, while oil countries are allowed to generate oil revenues subject to certain shocks in the economy, and these would contribute to their fiscal balances. So yeah, I've developed a model. I've defined the possibility of having debt default in the model, because if you want to estimate a debt limit, you need to have default in the model, which is a function of whether the economy has exceeded its debt limit or haven't. And from here, now this is also technical. So the way I simulate the fiscal limit is that I simulate each draw. I simulate a productivity shock, a shock to government spending, a shock to oil revenue, and at each draw I compute the fiscal limit as the present value of the government surpluses from 0 to infinity. So for infinity, I use the standard 200 periods as signifying infinity there. And then I replicate the same, or I repeat the same simulation 100,000 times so that I can achieve conversions. And from here, I can compute a conditional distribution for debt. And then I repeat all these 3 steps from 1 to 3 again for the different possible states of the economy in terms of its productivity, the level of government spending, or for oil exporting countries, how much oil they're generating. And the hardest part, I would say, of this project, or the most challenging, is the data, given that it's not abundantly available for the MENA region. But so far, I've been successful at calibrating the model for these countries specifically. So 6 oil exporters and 6 non-oil or middle-income countries. And using this calibration, we can actually arrive at the debt distribution of these economies. So for example, if you look here, let's take a specific country, I don't know, Algeria, for example. So the red cumulative distribution will tell us like the probability of default given the level of debt. So you can see that if the state of the economy is average, Algeria is still below. So the black line is the debt to GDP ratio in 2022. So Algeria is still below its debt limit. However, any negative shock to the economy, which would move Algeria to this dotted green debt limit, would imply that there's a risk of default, particularly around 20%. So the same analysis could be done for all countries in terms of their debt limit and how it varies with productivity shocks. Same thing, their debt limit and how it values with government spending. And you can think here of a scenario like the COVID-19 scenario, where governments needed to stimulate the economy, needed to spend more, and more spending imply a restriction on your debt limit. And for oil economies, we can also think of how the debt limit will vary with oil revenues. And when you have more revenues, you have more flexibility in terms of spending. This increases the limit of debt that you can sustain. However, lower oil revenues due to shocks, due to outside factors or foreign shocks, could negatively impact your debt limit or debt revenues. And briefly to tell you what are the next steps in this project. So the figures I've just shown you and the analysis is based on the assumption that transfers by the government are non-explosive, meaning that they're not going to grow exponentially over time. But we know nowadays that most of these economies struggle with financing social security, with financing health spending. So that we need to consider a more realistic scenario of the possibility of growing transfers by the government, and to study what are the implications for that in that case. And second, the way this fiscal limit or this fiscal space is computed is that it assumes that taxation is going to be optimal in the economy. But we know that there are many factors, including tax evasion, for example, which would imply that governments not necessarily can collect this high level of taxes. And then we need to consider a more realistic approach to how we model taxation in the model. And after I've considered these different scenarios, I hope to write up the final draft of the paper and to disseminate through seminars as well as through publication. So yeah, that's it for me. I hope I'm good at time. So
that was great time, Nadine. Really, really appreciate it. I think next on my list right now will be sorry.
Rabih, I think.
Rabih. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to clarify that I mistakenly thought that I will be presenting in a similar way that Dr. Tamer, my colleague, has done last year, that we have only one slide to present in our talk. So I didn't do but only one slide. Okay, so and let me clarify that this is not my project alone. It's a collaboration between Dr. Tamer Amin in science education and myself in math education. And this has been a very long collaboration between both of us addressing language issues in the Lebanese context. So, as you know, in Lebanon, we teach math and science in a foreign language. And this is due to several factors. Among these factors is the French mandate in the 1923 to the 1946, and then the globalization of the English. So we usually teach math and science and English or French, starting from elementary and even the KGs. And according to research, this causes difficulties for students and for teachers as well. And in particular, to international exams in Lebanon, like the TIMS, these are international exams. Our Lebanese students are not doing very well. Their achievement is very poor, even in comparison to Arabic countries. And so accordingly, and based on the literature, there is recently kind of consensus in the literature, whether in math education or in the science education, that the use of home language in such scenarios, in the multilingual societies or multilingual classrooms, we can use our home language, and in our case, it's the Lebanese colloquial language. We can use it as a source or a resource for meaning making. And this is positioned within the Vygotskian sociocultural theory that states that language and content, science or math, are interrelated, and we cannot separate these. So accordingly, we come with an assumption or a pedagogy to use a genre-specific pedagogy. What do you mean by genre? It means that when we teach science or math, there are specific contexts for specific language features. For example, when I'm asking students in the science to do classification or explanation, these are different genre. But in mathematics, for example, when I'm writing a geometric proof, this needs language features that is different from constructing a geometric figure or a word problem. So we adopt this genre pedagogy-based pedagogy. And also we have an assumption of kind of teaching that goes over the modeling and then scaffolding and then fading away. What do I mean by this? Modeling is that when the teacher can model in front of the students, and then scaffolding when there is a step backward, and then there is this balance between students' input and the teacher input, and then the fading away of the instruction of the teacher and the reliance on the students. So we adopt this kind of instruction. Further, we also take into consideration the use of translanguaging into consideration in our project. In addition to that, we have previously analyzed textbooks in math and in science from across cycles 1, 2, and 3. These are grades 1 till grade 9. And we came up with hypothetical kind of features regarding the curriculum, our expectations of the curriculum in math and science, and our expectations in terms of instruction regarding these genre features. And so based on these learning progressions, we have our ambition in this project now is to develop curriculum and instruction and to evaluate these. In particular, so does the strategic translanguaging enhance the effectiveness of these instructional activities? So what have we done till now? We have already conducted, so this needs several experimental evaluations, and I also want to stress that this is not an isolated study. It has become a research project for us, Dr. Tamer and myself, by which several graduate students are addressing different components of this research program, if I can say. So one experimental evaluation has been done a few months ago during this academic year in grade 6. And we have addressed the 3 classes. There are 2 quasi-experimental classrooms. So one classroom with the genre feature only for specific genre in grade 6. Another classroom where we also inserted what we call strategic translanguaging in addition to the genre feature. And then a third classroom was the control group. And from kind of descriptive statistics, the bar graphs, we have promising findings that has to do with the effectiveness of the strategic translanguaging, even though we didn't do yet the statistical analyses, but these findings are very promising. Okay, so what are we expected to do? We have also developed several online modules on the Tabshura platform. This is a platform managed by the Lebanese Alternative Learning NGO, so LAL. And we have been collaborating and working with them few years ago. We are using the IRB that we have already used for the experimental evaluation that we have already done in order to extend it to address two other designs in grade 3 for the science, for specific genre, and two other designs for the, two other design evaluation, one math, one in science in grade 3, and two other designs, one in math, one in science in grade 5, and not the grade 6, because we are now approaching the end of the academic year. So we have the ambition to collect data towards May, and before the school finishes. And so we are extending the IRB application that we have already used to do what we have done till now in the experimental evaluation in grade 6. And that's it, I think.
Thank you. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Rabih, for that presentation. And next on my list is Fatima Abu Salem. I also want to say for the people in the audience, if you want to start putting questions in the chat, in the Q&A, by all means do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amani. So I'm going to delegate for Shady, who will present on our work.
Sounds good. Thanks, Fatima. Thanks, Amani. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so I would like to first start by acknowledging, our RAs, very two talented RAs that worked with us on this project. I am Murad and Hiyam Ghanam. They did a wonderful job, really, in what we achieved. So I did stick to the one slide instruction. So our really overarching goal in this project was to quantify bias in Arabic historical text. And we did two case studies in this project. The first one focused on gender bias. What we did is we really looked at various Arabic corpora, so Lebanese news archives, particularly As-Safir and An-Nahar, which we obtained from the AUB library, and then digitized ourselves using tools such as optical character recognition. So we really received these as microfilms from the library. But we also looked at publicly available data sets such as Arabic Wikipedia and different electronic newspapers. And we tried to identify gender bias within these corpora through word embeddings. And what we did find is consistent biases against females, particularly when it comes to various professions, such as associating women strongly with professions like nurses, like secretary, like dancers, so low-level jobs, if you wish, compared to males who were associated with high-level professions such as managers, CEOs, doctors, ambassadors, engineers, and so on. And what we did is we tried to compare these different sources as well and try to see if there were any cultural differences based on the region. But what we really found at the end is that these biases were consistent in most cases across all data sets. We also found significant biases when it comes to or associations of family and art-related terms to women versus, for instance, career and basically success and other aspects or other terms being associated with males. This work was extensive, and I'm happy to say that it's now under review at the ACM Talib journal. Our second case study focused on discourse bias. And again, we looked at particularly the Lebanese newspapers as Safir and An-Nahar, because they had really opposing ideologies. And we tried to identify differences in the representation of various politicians and political parties, particularly during the Lebanese civil war in those newspapers. We did find significant difference in the representation. And what was interesting is we also tracked this across time within the period of the Lebanese civil war. And we identified 3 main periods of shifts in how these political entities were portrayed in those 2 newspapers that aligned actually with major shifts during the civil war. Now, when it comes to challenges, this work was actually quite challenging. And the main reason for this is that we're dealing with Arabic, and nobody had really looked at quantifying biases, whether gender bias or discourse bias for the Arabic language, at least according to the best of our knowledge when we started that work. And most of these approaches require extensive data, so training data for machine learning models, training word embeddings, lexicons, a lot of lexicons, a lot of word lists to quantify biases and so on. And none of that existed at all. So we had to really go about building these on all of these data sets and all of these resources ourselves with the help of our RAs, with the help of smart engineering, and also sometimes a bit of crowdsourcing. And in addition to this, so even if the resources are available, most of these approaches have been applied to English, and we're very successful at quantifying different types of biases for the English language or on English text. But doing this or taking those approaches and applying them in Arabic was quite challenging because of the complexity of the Arabic language in general. So Arabic is quite ambiguous. It's morphologically complex when it comes to any NLP task in general. So it also is grammatically gendered. So really, most of the work on English wouldn't work, for Arabic. So these were really quite some challenging, let's say, obstacles that we had to overcome. And then moving forward to next steps, we really would like to take our analyses and the work we have done on gender bias and discourse bias and try to apply it for other types of biases, such as sectarian or religious, and also to look at differences across languages. So if you take Wikipedia, for instance, and can we observe difference in biases or difference in the way, let's say, women are portrayed in the Arabic Wikipedia versus the English Wikipedia, or and we could definitely look at other multilingual corpora and try to see if, for instance, discourse around, the Israeli-Lebanese conflict is different based on, the corpus, its language, the origin and the culture and so on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And try to sum everything. But
if I may just append a final word, thank you, Shady, for speaking on our behalf, because I've realized that most of the attendees, if not all, do not come from a computer science background. Perhaps the overarching theme that we're trying to dig into is the ability of artificial intelligent natural language processing techniques to validate some of the very known results from the social science community around historical or gender-based biases. And once this is sort of gains momentum and trust, that we sort of hope that these AI-based models can scale to other conflicts and other scenarios whereby ideology detection perhaps is needed. Like people need to do that on the fly and very quickly, as in major conflicts erupting and us wanting to gather very quick insight. So that's maybe the overarching probably value of this work.
Thank you for that, Fatima and Shady. Shady, thank you for the presentation. And then last but not least is Rola. Rola, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. My study is about promoting environmental literacy. In this world, we are facing many environmental problems, and for that, it is a goal to promote environmental literacy among our youth. And by environmental literacy, in this study, I will look at environmental literacy in the lens of argumentation and decision-making related to social science-based problems. These problems are open-ended, they are related to students' everyday lives, and they involve multiple perspectives and interpretations. And in this these social science-based problems are referred to in the literature as socio-scientific issues. So in this case, we will look at socio-scientific issues that are environmental. So the project aims to answer two questions. What are the argumentation and decision-making of university students? And that will establish a baseline for us in response to socio-scientific issues that are environmental. And then we will use this data to design a course to enhance the argumentation and decision-making related to environmental problems. So this project involves two stages. And in the first stage, which we have addressed so far, there were participants, AUBs who are AUB students. They were from different disciplines. And these participants were asked to respond to a questionnaire. And this questionnaire explored their environmental literacy. It asked them to generate arguments and decision-making related to socio-scientific problems. And these socio-scientific problems were water fluoridation, global warming, and genetically modified food. So these university students had responses to that. And then we analyzed the students' responses and we used them to design the environmental literacy course. But for the first stage, for the analysis of the responses, we found that students generally do not have informed argumentation and decision-making related to these environmental issues. For example, they presented arguments that were not based on any pieces of evidence, or at best, they presented arguments that were supported by only one evidence. So to evaluate argumentation and decision-making, we looked at the quantity of the evidence that they provided and also the quality of the evidence they provided and the connection between the evidence and the arguments and the decision they made. So in general, students did not appear to have very informed argumentation and decision-making. So that was a baseline for us to design a course, and I have been working on designing a course that it would address different environmental problems related to deforestation, to waste management, to climate change. And that brings me to the next stage of the project, which is to test the effectiveness of the designed course in enhancing argumentation and decision-making related to environmental socio-scientific issues. So after testing the effectiveness, and when we find that this course is effective, hopefully we can use that as a model to integrate at different places, whether at the school level or at the university level. And we hope that this will enhance the environmental literacy of our youth. The challenges and the obstacles related to this project have been minimal, and they have been addressed. And we stuck to the initial proposal, and it's proceeding as was planned. And by the end of this project, I aim to present more of the project results at a conference, and then submit a manuscript to be published as an article in a journal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rola, for that presentation. Thank you all for those magnificent presentations. As we wait for questions from the audience, I mean, anybody can put questions in the chat, raise your hand, or put it in the Q&A. Also, please, panelists, if you want to ask questions of one another, that's great. But if I may start, we still have time, which is great. So I have a question for each of the panelists and the excellent papers. I'll start with Nadine. Nadine, so I'm very delighted to see that you're really capturing macroeconomic trends in the Arab world. I sort of feel that the economics community was doing a really good job at this in the discipline, maybe up until the 90s. And then with the Arab Spring, the 2000s neoliberal reforms, the Arab Spring, and where we are now, more of the aid organizations or the internationals are documenting, but we're not seeing much of this in the academy. So I'm really happy to and encouraged to see this. When I guess the question that you probably always get, when you see these macroeconomic numbers, they look fairly unstable, as you were pointing out. Any shock might sort of rock the situation. The region right now is in this very tumultuous place. Given the data that you have, if and God forbid, if we were to see an escalation of events in more countries pulled into this conflict, what does it mean for the economies of these countries? So that's for you, Nadine. For Rabih, thank you so much. I mean, you sort of, and your co-author Tamit, right? So it's a really great question that you're looking at in terms of thinking about how curriculum, because we often think about, well, the math and sciences should be taught in these other languages, but also, you know, how literate, you know, French literacy in math is not really, shouldn't constitute a language barrier for countries like Lebanon. And what you're uncovering that indeed it may be, especially when you look at the performance of students vis-a-vis other students in Lebanon versus other students in the region who are receiving their education in Arabic. So I felt like you were sort of arguing for, you know, you're arguing for language training in Arabic, or at least sort of understanding what the different languages mean for students in Lebanon. And as I was thinking, I mean, in political science, Rabih, there's just all these arguments about the importance of language in the curriculum, not simply for sort of, if I may say, like, you know, socialization or indoctrination, but as just a tool of nationalism and national pride. I didn't hear you talk about nationalism and national pride. I think you were sort of talking more about like just basic competencies. But I was wondering if you could sort of add to that in terms of like if students are being encouraged to learn French only for certain subject matters, is this sort of creating like an identity issue where they feel that, you know, or is it really that the multilingual curriculum is a little bit overwhelming for the students and they can't keep up. So I was trying to figure out like, well, what is really, why do we see the dip in Lebanon? Others might argue in terms of Lebanon over the last several years has sustained all these economic crises, the civil war in Syria, you've had an influx of refugees. So how can we, delineate what sort of the causal chain is if we were going to go there in terms of like this language issue? But really important research topic in terms of Shady and Fatma's paper on biases. The gender bias is really phenomenal. I think it's unfortunately we see this, and for you to document it even in these sort of quote unquote new forms of communication, which should be quote unquote modernizing the region, we see this reinforcement of biases. What I'd like to know, like when I talk to students here who want to work in this space, and again from the social sciences, not computer science, where I think the methods are more sort of sophisticated. The big issue always is how do you train the algorithms to pick up the bias? And as you mentioned numerous times, Shady, doing this in Arabic is all the more difficult. And I'm really curious about that because especially with Arabic, a lot of our and I'm not a linguistic expert, so forgive me all, but a lot of our common vocabulary is already gendered masculine. So how do you capture the bias if we're sort of like guiding students on this? Last but not least, Rola, on the environmental literacy, this is an important topic. I have two questions for you. One is just for information, in this last round of the Air Barometer, which I serve as with my colleagues as co-PI, we did include a the most elaborate battery on environmental issues. And so we can give you, we can share those data on Lebanon and break it down between youth and adults. But I will tell you from Wave 8 data, the previous round, when we ask about the environment, it's not a top priority for citizens in the region. And oftentimes the argument is, well, when you have instability and war and crisis, you have people like, people got like, they need to survive. And the challenge for environmental literacy is how to make it, that it's not sort of like a post-materialist value that, this other thing that we're committed to. How do you sort of embed it in survival sort of language? And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how you're approaching that from a curricular or literacy perspective. Those are my questions. Now there's other questions. Sorry about that, those long questions. I want to give each of you a chance to respond, and then I'll go to the audience, the other questions that came in, if you may. I guess we'll go in the order with Nadine going first. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'll start first. So thank you, Amani, for the question. So basically, yes, as I'm saying from the data, so the model is actually calibrated to the data. So even the sizes of the shocks that have impacted these economies historically is also estimated using the data that I have. So, and yeah, as I showed you briefly in these commutative distribution functions for debt, like some countries which are very close to their debt limit will tend to struggle more the more negative shocks, the more they are hit by negative shocks. And this is an issue in middle income countries more than high income oil exporting economies, which are really still far away from their debt limit based on the findings I've just discovered. But yeah, for more middle income countries, these are still more vulnerable to negative shocks impacting their economies. And we've seen several of these shocks affect them in the most recent decades, starting with the uprisings, as you said, going on to COVID-19 and so on. And I'll go on to answering Ali's question in the chat, which are directly related to me. So Ali, for Algeria, yeah, as you said, it's a small oil producer. So I've classified it with the non-oil producers, but it could be easily extended to include the gas market as well, and then consider the implications of gas revenues in there. For the stochastic transition, no, the model does not allow for stochastic transition from being a non-oil to an oil-producing economy. So it assumes that the state of the economy as to whether it's an oil or non-oil producer is fixed. However, the oil revenues themselves can vary. So say, for example, the economy's resources have been depleted, oil revenues will decrease, and this will be reflected within the model. And third, I don't treat oil prices exogenously, I treat oil revenues exogenously. So it's a product of the price and quantity. So you can think this of a reduced form specification of capturing shock to oil revenue, either because prices have changed or because quantities have changed. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Nadine, for that. Rabih.
Amani, if I understood you clearly, okay, so first thing, we are not addressing French yet. We are addressing school and the instruction, the English instruction. And the school lab that we have selected uses English as a language, foreign language for instruction for teaching math and science. One of our ambitious plans is to extend to French as well. The other thing is that our main purpose in this project or program of research is the design of instructional activities and material based on our hypothetical learning progressions that resulted from our analyses of textbooks in terms of genre features. And then we go into another phase that has to do with the evaluation. We are not addressing identity per se, but we are addressing the development of this material in order to strengthen the use of language while learning math and science. This is our main goal. But I want to stress that from a Vygotskian perspective, I have stated that based on a sociocultural theory, that language is interrelated to meaning making and content. But there is also consensus in the literature that language has to do with culture, and thus it is interrelated to identity. But we are not addressing it as one of our research questions, the identity thing. I'm not sure if I have addressed your comment or if there is
So I guess no, this is very illuminating, Rabih, and it's very important. So I guess what I was trying, and again, forgive me, because this is a great interdisciplinary conversation, but from your perspective and from your approach, if you're going to improve foreign language instruction, whether it's English or French, ultimately, is it about increasing competency and consumption in terms of the student's ability to understand this, or is there some other barrier? That's why I was.
Okay, so we are adopting the Lebanese curriculum, the learning outcomes based on the Lebanese curriculum. But as I have stated, we are adopting a genre-based instruction with the assumption of a pedagogy that goes from modeling into scaffolding into fading and by building online activities that address specific genre. And when I say genre, these are language, lexicogrammar, structure, function, features in science and in math. So we are addressing the language aspects, and recently we went beyond that into practices as well, because when a scientist performs specific experiment and wants to do some classification or some explanation, so these are practices that are embedded, and so we are further going in in this direction by not only relying on the language features, but also beginning to address practices as well.
Excellent.
But we are not changing the learning outcomes based on the Lebanese, as stated by the Lebanese government.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification, Rabih. Appreciate it. Next, I think, Shady and Fatima. And
yeah, sure. Okay, maybe I'll start and then Fatima can, of course.
Yeah, I'll get probably Nicholas' question in the chat.
And there's a question for you in the chat as well. If you guys want to take it like Nadine.
Yes, yeah. I'll address the chat question when after Shad is done. Yeah.
and I'll go back to Rabih after Rola. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so regarding your question, Amani, so really what we did is we used the word embeddings as a sort of a lens or a tool to quantify bias in particular, historical corpora. So really was more like, okay, use these word embeddings to like try to figure out are these corpora biased and biased with respect to whom and biased at what periods of time and so on. But typically these word embeddings are really the foundation of all the AI tools that are used in natural language processing, whether it's question answering or document ranking or all these, machine translation, speech recognition, and so on. So really, they are the mechanism that empower all downstream AI tasks. And so if they are biased, then you can expect that all of these tools and applications will also be biased. And there's a lot of work that actually shows this. In fact, most of the work try to focus on word embeddings, trying to identify whether they're biased or not. And then there is a lot of work done on debiasing them. The other thing so when it comes to Arabic, it's quite challenging, as I said, because of its nature, complexity, and so on. And that aspect that you also stressed on, Amani, which is being a gendered language. We tried in our analysis to see if that makes a huge effect by doing gender disentanglement. And what we saw is that it helped with the reduction of bias, quantification to some extent, but this was not consistent, and we could still see some significant biases even after doing this. So I think that is to sum up my answer to your question, which I thought was fantastic. And most of the tools, downstream tools and tasks and that uses machine learning have been shown to be extremely biased when it comes to gender, ethnicity, and other protected attributes as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Shady. So I want to get to the question raised by Nicholas, and how would I assess the state of language text analysis today? I would say extremely behind. The reason is not just because Arabic is a very difficult language. The reason is that the Arab world is very heterogeneous. And if we were to actually study the very things that matter on social media or anywhere where people are talking, what we've witnessed is that there's a huge discrepancy in also the way that ideas are articulated. So there's already the problem of people expressing themselves in spoken, let's say Lebanese or Levantine language or North African, people sometimes using Latin letters and to transliterate the way they perceive the sort of the contextual sort of semantics of hate speech here in Lebanon as opposed to somewhere else. So it opened Pandora's box for us, and it's not just because it's a gendered language, it's actually because of all the nuances in the Arab world, which in my very modest opinion make me think that the Arabic is an extremely painfully low resource language. And as a result, it was very difficult in the sort of short span where NLP models have developed that this has made it to mainstream commercialized platforms or tools the way you're asking. Now, if it's only formal Arabic, of course, there are huge advancements, but I think they're still tied to academic research groups like in Qatar or NYU, Abu Dhabi, and of course, us here trying to break some barriers. But we've encountered problems and hurdles in trying to find kind of open source or platforms which we can use on the fly. It's almost like we have to build everything from scratch all the time.
Thank you for that. And yeah, so you to your point, Shady and Fatima, that data appendix is going to be one that people are going to look at in terms of thinking about all this classifying and debiasing. That is going to be also really interesting. Rola, and then I want to circle back to Rabih because he has a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Amani, for your question. The way science is taught, whether in schools or at the university level, is usually like ready-made science. students are exposed to problems that are related to the science concepts with no connection to society, with no connection to real life. So this course will make science real, will expose students to real data. So when we present real world problems, we want to make them base their argumentation and their decision making on evidence. So the idea is to make them more rely on evidence. And it's true what you were saying, that environmental problems are not a top priority in the Arab world. So we need to make a concerted effort to present them, to present students or to expose them to the environmental problems, because these are part of their lives later on, and they'll be facing them in their lives. So, and we are bearing consequence to climate change, for example, they are seeing it. So when we focus on these issues, we raise awareness and make science relevant, and we show the implications of science in their lives. So.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Rola. And at some point, I know you're introducing a course, so we'd love to see how that goes as well. So Rabih, back to you. You got a question from Hannah. I don't know if you saw it in the chat.
Yeah, I've read it. So I want to say that we are not addressing STEM, even though I'm collaborating very closely with Dr. Tamer for more than 8 years, and we have done like SMEC Summer Institute 7 years ago, based on a Scholl grant. It was a very intensified 5 days training for math and science teachers. We have this long journey, and we are addressing the development of online material, but we are not like mixing math and science for STEM purposes. So this is one aspect of the question. As for policy, one of our ambitions is to get involved with policymakers here in Lebanon. And very recently, we have applied for a Spencer Vision grant that has to do with the planning in order to submit for a larger Spencer research grant. And there were like people from the government, from education at the policy level who were intending to collaborate with us. Regretfully, we did not get this vision grant, but we are still like trying to get other resources, and we have we are motivated to work at the policy level at the Lebanese with the Lebanese government. And the NGO that I have referred to, the LAL, Lebanese Alternative Learning, they who have the Tapshura platform, they have very close relation and with a continuous talk with the Lebanese government, and hopefully at some time we can address policy issues.
That would be great, Rabih, and I'd be curious to see where you land on the recommendations as well with this project. So we are at time. Any of the panelists have any last minute input or question, or want to add something? Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much. The research is fabulous. It's so wonderful to be seeing the progress that you've made on the projects. We have recorded this, so we hope we will be sharing it, and we look forward to continuing working with you. So thank you so much. Thank you, Laura and Christy.
Thank you. Thank you so much.